Good morning, everybody. My name is Sakile Silechena, and I work with the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. I work with several colleagues here in the Secretariat on protected and conserved areas, supporting parties implement Target 3 of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. I have online my colleagues from the CBD Secretariat, Mariano Castro and Magdalena Garcia. We also have our really good friends and colleagues from different organizations, our long-standing partner, the IUCN, World Commission on Protected Areas. The Vice Chair is here with us too, Brent Mitchell. We have Harry Jonas from WWF, who was also the co-chair of the WCPA's OECM Specialist Group. We have Daniel Monowick, who is from the IUCN, another good partner of ours. We have Lucia Ruiz, who is also from WWF, a good partner. We have Sunita Chowdhury from ICIMOD, and Carolina Hazen from the Nature Conservancy. And they're going to be speaking about different aspects relating to other effective area-based conservation measures. We are going to start without further ado. I believe that everybody on the call on this webinar has seen the program for today. But if not, I will just ask Magdalena to put it up while I give just a brief overview about OECMs and their where they came from and the relevant COP decisions. So, Magdalena, if you can just share that program so that everybody has it. So, while we're doing that, I would like to share with you a brief history of OECMs. I think that everybody on this call is interested in OECMs, and everybody on this call has a little bit of an idea about OECMs, but just to make sure that we are all on the same page. So OECMs, they emerged from the recognition that areas outside of protected areas were also contributing positive biodiversity outcomes. And OECMs came about as a way to recognize the contributions made by Indigenous peoples and local communities, private actors, and other sectors that were doing really good work in terms of conserving biodiversity. And it was also a way to promote, encourage, support connectivity across landscapes, and close the ecological and governance gaps that existed in the protected areas landscape. So OECMs were first referenced in 2010 in Aichi Target 11 as other effective areas. So when I say first reference, I think I'm talking about the Convention on Biological Diversity. So OECMs, other effective area-based conservation measures, were first referenced under the convention in 2010 in Aichi Target 11 as other effective area-based conservation measures. At COP13, that was in 2016, parties requested the Secretariat to work with IUCN and other partners to provide clarification on what exactly is an OECM and to provide guidance on identifying and reporting OECMs. And just to pause to say, We don't designate OECMs, we identify them and we report on them. And then the formal definition and guidance on OECMs was adopted in the CBD decision of the Conference of the Parties 14.8 in 2018. IUCN, WCPA, FAO, and other partners have also developed guidelines and guidance and toolkits on identification of OECMs. And perhaps Brent or Daniel or Harry will talk about that in a little bit. And so when the global biodiversity community moved on to the adoption of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, they adopted Target 3 of the framework. And Target 3 explicitly mentions other effective area-based conservation measures alongside protected areas and alongside indigenous and traditional territories, much like IT Target 11 did. And in addition to a target of achieving 30% of protection and conservation, the target also mentions representativity, connectivity, and equitable governance issues. And so these are criteria that apply as well to protected areas as well as to OECMs. So from our perspective, OECMs, they give us a more inclusive outcomes-based approach to conservation. They strengthen integrity and equity because of the diverse stakeholders involved in OECMs, and they are key to helping us achieve the ambitious 30% target and the biodiversity and conservation outcomes that we need to see out of that. So I won't pause here for questions if that's all right with everybody. I think we have 2 hours, and we hope that all our presenters will be able to make their presentations within the allotted time, and then we'll have a little bit of time afterwards for Q&A. So I won't take up much more of your time. I want to introduce our good friend at the Secretariat, Mr. Brent Mitchell, who is Vice Chair of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas. And he has been key and instrumental in all this work that we've been trying to do on Target 3 and on creating a sort of a global partnership on Target 3, which has now been morphed into a community of practice. So thank you, Brent, and over to you.
Well, I have to unmute before I share the screen. So, hi everybody. Thank you very much for tuning in this morning. Hopefully you can see my screen. Shout if you can't. But yeah, I've been asked to talk about what we're calling now a community of practice to support implementation of Target 3. And I'll mostly stick to that. It was sometime before COP15 that we began to talk with Sakile and others about the need, once we had the target signed off, to provide an opportunity for all the different people that would be involved in implementing it to share information, to test ideas with their peers, to generally have a place to support each other in going forward. And this wasn't a new idea. There have been similar efforts related to previous decisions of the CBD, notably the Friends of the Program of Work on Protected Areas and its successor during the predecessor to Target 3, the global partnership on ACHI 11. So we wanted to see if we could create a space similar to that, an activity similar to that, and maybe even a little bigger to match the ambition of Target 3. So at COP15, we brought some people together just to see if there was support for this idea, and it was overwhelmingly supported. And so we brought more people together 2 years ago now to begin to frame how this what we were then calling a Target 3 partnership might go forward. And I'm not going to go into all of these outcomes, but um, most of them are kind of common sense. But again, we had a lot of people who saw the value in bringing people together, giving people an opportunity to share and learn in some fashion. And it's interesting. I will share one of the outcomes, the prioritization that we did, and the top vote getter, if you will, was further understanding of what OECMs are and what they can be in the context of Target 3. So that really brings us to our topic today. After that big workshop 2 years ago, we started looking at structure for the partnership. We wanted it to be have a home within the CBD Secretariat, and fortunately, Sakile was very interested and supportive of that. That WCPA would help technically, and others in IUCN and other partners like those on the webinar today. And we began to kind of almost develop a bit of a structure and a hierarchy as to how we would go about this. And then, frankly, we kind of hit a wall because in talking about something that started to sound like a new organization, it raised some doubts that maybe we were creating something that would duplicate what others were doing, that it might draw resources from other priorities. So we really had to step back. And one of the concerns is that we might be duplicating what the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People does in bringing together a number of parties that are on board, fully on board with Target 3. But we work very well with our friends at the Hack, including hosting the 30 by 30 solutions with them and the Nature Conservancy. And just side promotion, if you have not looked at this, this is a curated online repository, links to guidance and information on every aspect of Target 3. So I would highly recommend that you have a look at that. But the point is, we partner with the Hack quite a bit um, on that and on their other tools. However, the Hack is, it is a creature of the parties, and the other platforms are exclusive to the governments that have signed on. And we and our partners at the Hack felt the need for something broader, more inclusive of NGOs, of community organizations, indigenous groups, funders, everybody who has a role in implementing Target 3. And we all work together putting on sub-regional workshops on Target 3. Here's the one from Africa. There have been from other regions. There's one for Southeast Asia that is coming up. These are a great example of creating opportunities for people to share and learn, but they're quite expensive, and they're a lot of work to pull off. So we can't rely entirely on these big get-togethers. So we need to look at virtual opportunities, and we're trying to move to more of a model of communities of practice where there's no hierarchy. People can come and go and share as they will. As this circle implies, people may be very involved in the core. Others may just come and go and be on the periphery. People may move in and out of those circles of engagement over time as their needs and circumstances change. But it's all about sharing information, experience, knowledge, and lessons learned. And while these are less structured than what we originally envisioned with the partnership, they're not amorphous either. And I had the opportunity to work with someone who's kind of the guru of these communities of practice some years ago in developing same in the U.S. National Park Service back in happier days. But one of the things, two of the things that we learned is that while they are voluntary and open and you can come and go, there needs to be some sort of support, some sort of backbone organization. And that's what our colleagues at the CBD Secretariat, that's the role they're playing in hosting this webinar today. Some group that makes sure that things happen, that people get together. And the other is that everybody who participates at any level has to get something out of it. Even if you're only giving your time this morning to participate, you need to find something of value to you. So I'm going to pivot from communities of practice and speak from the WCPA and just a few notes on OECMs in context before my colleagues get into the details. As you all know, there are three broad kinds of areas that are in the target protected areas, OECMs, and indigenous and traditional territories. And one of our growing concerns as Target 3 moves forward is that we not confuse people with the differences of all of these things. We need to understand them, but we want to make sure that we don't confuse people and that they lose sight of the commonalities. And if we're doing some work now to really look at what are the similarities. And really taking an outcomes perspective, not an intentionality perspective, but an outcomes perspective. And there's much more in common with these things than is different. Protected areas have objectives for conservation. Sometimes they fail in those objectives or stumble, but that's the intent. OECM's effective is right there in the definition. If it's not effective, it's not an OECM. And we don't have a definition and criteria for indigenous and traditional territories, but they are implied to be effective, and we know that they very often can be. I hope you will learn this morning that uh, uh, the first filter for OECMs is that they're not in protected areas. However, there are many OECMs that have a primary conservation objectives, and so they are not very different from protected areas. And even those where conservation may just be a secondary objective, it's still strong, and there's not a lot of distance between category 5 and 6. So very quickly, just they're more similar than different. OECMs are not new. As Sakile mentioned, the original intent was to recognize places that were already effective. And so we wanted to do that. But they're not new. This is not a shiny new toy. And another thing, we need to dissuade, particularly governments, that these are not an easy alternative. That's not a cheap alternative. The whole idea of recognizing OECMs so they can be supported to continue doing what they're doing. And my last point is ultimately, first principle is this is about the birds, it's about the bugs, it's about the wild crop relatives, it's even about the microbes, the ones that maybe we don't like, but many of them do things, many good things for us. We really have to remember that if places aren't helping to restore the abundance of nature, then they're not OECMs. They're not things that we need to be talking about in terms of Target 3. So as you get into the details, always come back to that touch point. And finally, I said, that communities of practice, people have to find rewards. I hope you find something in this webinar today that is useful to you and that you'll continue to participate. So thank you. And I think I'm turning it over to Harry. Is that right?
Thank you. Thank you, Brett, for a really great overview of how we started, our intentions, how we hit a sort of road bump, and how we're evolving. And thank you for the contextualization of OECMs in the context of the WCPA, and just really helping to set the stage for our discussions today. I'd like to invite Harry Jonas. He is a senior director for conservation areas at WWF US. He's also co-chair of the IUCN WCPA Specialist Group on OECMs. So, Harry, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Sakila, very much. Just double checking you can all see my screen now. Okay. Should be good. Friends, thank you very much. And thank you to the CBD for being the primary organizer of this event. Sakila, in your introduction, I was just reflecting on the fact that everything you've said is now considered axiomatic. It's considered agreed. It's a fact. Not so long ago, the world wasn't necessarily agreeing everything you've just said. And so again, for me, it just underscores the value of international law, of the CBD, of these collective processes where we really can move forwards the way we think about and do conservation, amongst other things, but conservation in this context. So friends, great pleasure. Thank you very much for the introductions and everything that you, Sakile, and Brent have set out. Friends, over the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking to you about the CBD definition of an OECM, about the criteria for identifying OECMs, as Sakile underscored. I'm going to talk about reporting of OECMs very briefly, and then just open up some discussions about opportunities and challenges before colleagues then step in with some real world examples of these extraordinary places from around the world. Those of you who know me know that I always like to begin presentations with the absolute take home. I think this is the take home of my 15 minutes. It's certainly, and it could well be the take home for this whole event. And that is simply put, that identifying, that reporting, monitoring, and strengthening OECMs offers a significant opportunity to promote and support effective long-term conservation worldwide when done in tandem with protected areas and ITTs. Huge opportunity, some challenges, and let's get into them. So let me begin by introducing the framework to you. As Brent underscored, there are now 3 pathways, as they're being referred to under Target 3, protected areas that we know and love, OECMs, that's the focus of today's discussion, as well as indigenous and traditional territories. And they are now the focus of, amongst other things, the new subsidiary body on Article 8J. There's going to be a workshop in Montreal quite soon, and then the subsidiary body is actually meeting in Panama in October to further that agenda. So really, really important agenda moving forward. We'll focus on OECMs today. As Brent said, don't forget that fuller context. In short, this is the shorthand for what is an OECM. An OECM is a site that delivers the long-term, effective in situ conservation of biodiversity outside of protected areas. That is the shorthand. This is the full CBD definition of an OECM, agreed, as Sakile said, in 2018 COP14 that was held in Sharm el-Sheikh. A major, major outcome. I prefer not to go through it as a paragraph. I prefer to break the definition down into its constituent parts. It's just easier to engage with. So the definition says that an OECM should be geographically defined. We should know what the area is we're talking about. That area, that site should be outside of a protected area. It should be governed and managed in ways that achieve positive, sustained long-term conservation outcomes. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And where there are ecosystem functions and services, they should be conserved. And where there are cultural, spiritual, socioeconomic, or other important values, 2 things. They should be respected on the one hand, and equally, they shouldn't undermine the conservation outcomes of that area. So that's a simple overview of the CBD definition of an OECM. And the same decision that sets out that definition, decision 14.8, also sets out 4 criteria for identifying an OECM. And friends, even if you haven't looked up a bit of international law before, on this one, I really urge you to Google decision, CBD decision 14.8, and have a good look. You'll see the definition. And in Annex 3, you'll see a beautifully laid out, very clear explanation of how you identify an OECM and some further guidance there. It's really clear that decision is the mother of all guidance, of all tools, of all other information on OECMs. It's worth going to the source, I always think. So that decision 14.8 provides these 4 criteria, not recognized as and that clearly these mirror the definition very directly. So to identify an OECM, the site should be not recognized as a protected area, and it should be defined. It should be governed and managed. It should achieve the effective in situ conservation of biodiversity. And where there are ecosystem functions or services, they should be conserved. And where there are a range of values, they should be respected, but also not negatively impact the area's conservation outcomes. As I say, if there's one thing to add to your to-do list from this session, go and have a look at decision 14.8. It's a beautiful, very clear definition. So friends, quite often what happens at this stage in a presentation, if people are hearing this more or less for the first time, you may be thinking to yourself, well, that all sounds good, but how is that different from a protected area? So let's look at that. And Brent opened this up a bit. Let's get into it a bit more deeply. A protected area, as defined by IUCN, by the CBD in 92, and then an IUCN in 2008, defines a protected area as an area that is recognized, dedicated, and managed for conservation. Conservation is the primary objective of that site, or at least equal primary. And so the management objective for conservation is the defining feature of a protected area, okay? It's about intending to conserve biodiversity in a site. In contrast, an OECM is a site that delivers the effective in situ conservation of biodiversity outside a PA. That site does not have to have a primary conservation objective. And so in contrast to a protected area, the defining feature of an OECM is the conservation outcome in a site which is outside of a protected area. I hope that's clear. And if it isn't, anybody on the line, we would be very, very happy to follow up with you and further help you with that distinction. It is an important one and quite simple when the penny drops. So as Brent was saying as well, last year, a number of us ran a first review, the first analysis actually of the emerging contributions of OECMs to Target 3. Some really interesting findings there. First of all, OECMs are already making significant contributions to global biodiversity, at least their recognition is. But we also found a point that Brent made, which is there are sites that meet the definition of a protected area, but for one or other reason can't be or haven't been or would prefer not to be reported as a protected area in a particular country. And some of those sites are being reported as OECMs, and that is fine, although IUCN WCPA recommends that if a site meets the definition of a protected area, it should be reported as a PA. Where it can't be for whatever one or other reason, we think it's perfectly acceptable, even useful to report it as an OECM, and maybe down the line that designation can change to better reflect what it actually is. And friends, as well, some really interesting news. You know, there are now almost, even though the definition and criteria are only agreed in 2018, there are already 6,500 OECMs that have been reported to the World Database on OECMs, managed by UNEP WCMC, covering 2.35 million square kilometers, which is 230 plus million hectares around the world. And this now includes, very interestingly, some areas beyond national jurisdiction. That happened a couple of months ago. Super interesting development, and something that we're looking at very actively. So what's interesting when you bring all of this together, especially when you think about it in the broader context of PAs and ITTs, is that pre-2010, as Sekele said, the world really looked at conservation through a protected area lens, at least from the international level. And they would look at landscapes, seascapes, and waterscapes and just see those green protected areas that are highlighted, the 3 green ones. Now, the OECM framework, and maybe ITTs sooner than later, gives rise to a much more complex picture, a much more integrated picture across these scapes. And of course, that then necessarily would improve ecological connectivity and ecological representation as well. You get a much fuller picture. You have more ways of more appropriately recognizing conservation efforts without needing to squeeze things into one or other box, and it can give rise to a much more organic and appropriately supported forms of conservation. So moving on, if you would like more information on identifying OECMs, here is a QR code. I'll have the same QR code in a minute if you want to ready your phones then, and that'll take you through to the IUCN WCPA site that you can download this site level tool for identifying OECMs. You can use that for identifying sites at the local level. In one slide, I'm going to talk about reporting. When you're identifying a site, you can self-assess. But if there's not a self-assessment, then free, prior, and informed consent should be sought from the governing authority, who have the right to say no. And then after that assessment, assuming it goes ahead, and if the site meets all the CBD criteria and is therefore identified as an OECM, we think best practice, again, if it's not self-assessed, would be to seek FPIC before reporting that site. Everybody is 100% should be 100% clear about what's happening. Those data can be reported to the World Database on OECMs, as I said, managed by UNEP WCMC. That fourth bullet, I'll let you read that. It just tells you the kinds of data that should be presented. And then in the fifth bullet, government as parties to the CBD can report directly to UNEP WCMC, and others will require some form of third-party verification that UNEP WCMC would provides guidance on. And there's the email for sending the data in. It's quite a simple, relatively simple process. And if you're on the line, thanks always to colleagues at UNEP WCMC for the brilliant job that you do. My last couple of slides, friends, simply says this. I am sure you're getting a strong sense, and the reason you joined this call is because you are very aware of the significant opportunities that this framework offers. It, as Sekele underscored, it recognizes existing efforts that conserve biodiversity, where humans are living in harmony with nature, as per the CBD's credo. It helps underscore to ensure effective, representative, and well-connected conservation networks across landscapes, seascapes, inland waters. Obviously, that's going to have positive effects for ecosystem services and a range of other values. That will promote climate resilience, and all of that, when you total it up, will provide benefits to people at a whole range of scales. So, just layers of benefits, layers of opportunities as well. And this is just a schematic for you. I won't linger, but it just gives you an idea of when nature thrives, people thrive as well. But friends, there are challenges. There is a significant worldwide gap in knowledge and expertise. That's why sessions like this are so important, and national level roadmaps are so important, etc. For me, this is the one which vexes me the most. There is a risk, serious risk, that the OECM framework may be misapplied to sites that do not meet the CBD's ecological criteria. As Brent underscored, we don't want sites that do not meet the ecological criteria, that do not deliver the long-term in situ conservation of biodiversity, being reported as OECMs. That would go against the CBD's guidance set out in Decision 14.8. Equally, friends, we don't want sites being reported where free, prior, and informed consent has not been sought. And then it'll be really important for all of us to work on enhancing the why, as colleagues and I often put it, the why of OECMs. If any of us manage a site, why should I spend time reporting and then monitoring my site to ensure that it's included in these global targets? So incentives at the national and subnational level will be extremely important. Yes, I'm going to finish with this slide actually to give time for others. And I just want to say, great. Everything that I have talked about, including this beautiful new deck that we have developed, is available to you if you go to the IUCN WCPA's specialist group on OECM's website. Here's the QR code. On the left-hand side, here is the guidance that we developed, published at the end of last year. And on that website, you'll find a host of resources to support your onward OECM journey. Thank you very, very much. Sekile, back to you.
Thank you, Harry. Thank you for that really broad and educational presentation. You touched on what it is, what OECMs are, beyond just the definition, the criteria for identifying and reporting. I really liked the contrast you gave us between protected areas and OECMs. That was really great. And I like the various slides that you provided that showed us that it's not just about what you label sites, it's really creating integration across the landscape so that we have conservation benefits, but also so that people can thrive as well. So thank you for that. And I encourage anybody that's interested to really follow those QR codes to find the information that IUCN, WCPA, and other organizations have done towards contributing to the site level assessment tool and the guidance on OECMs. So now, colleagues, before I introduce Daniel, I would just like to, I think I forgot to say at the beginning that we are recording this webinar, and it will be available on the CBD YouTube page. If you are uncomfortable with that, I'm not sure how. I'm letting you know in case you're uncomfortable, and so maybe you might not want to turn on your camera, or you might not want to make your comments public. You can send us the comments privately, and we can ask the questions on your behalf. And so, moving on, I would like to introduce Daniel Monowick. He serves as a regional area-based conservation coordinator for IUCN's Eastern and Southern Africa Regional Office. He's currently facilitating national dialogues on OECMs in several countries across Eastern and Southern Africa. The CBD Secretariat team had the pleasure of sitting down with Daniel at 2 events in Southern and Eastern Africa earlier this year, and the work they're doing on OECMs is really interesting, really groundbreaking, and I'm looking forward to the presentation from Daniel. Daniel, over to you.
Great, thanks, Akili, for that introduction. And yeah, it's a real privilege to be here to make this presentation to you this afternoon. Let me just start my timer to make sure that I don't run over time. Yeah, so as Akila said, I'm going to present the work that we've been doing in the region. It's been really great to have that introduction from Sekile and Harry and Brent on where OECMs come from. My presentation is going to be a little bit of a different focus. It's going to really be around the process that countries follow to start identifying and reporting OECMs. And so I won't be sharing very specific case studies. I think we'll hear about case studies and presentations after me. But essentially, I'm going to present this work under IUCN's regional strategy for supporting Target 3, which is called SPACE, which stands for space for people and conservation effectiveness. And it really embraces or encompasses what we consider the key components of Target 3. And I think, as Harry said, we really do need to remember that when we talk about OECMs, we can't forget the context in which it's being positioned. So I'm going to talk a little bit around how we're supporting countries to identify, assess, strengthen, and report OECMs, and doing that by building these national OECM processes or dialogues, as we like to call them. You've all seen the text to Target 3, and so I won't go through that. Again, it's just to reiterate that when we're talking about OECMs, we really need to consider all of these other fundamental components, what I call the qualitative components of Target 3, around that importance for biodiversity, that we have these networks of protected areas and OECMs and indigenous and traditional territories that are being effectively managed and conserved and equitably governed. And in our regional context, the sustainable use is really important, because a lot of these sites that we're assessing as OECMs are people living in these naturescapes and living off these naturescapes, and their reliance on those natural resources is fundamental to their ability to conserve them. And so it really needs to be compatible with sustainable use. I'm going to talk a little bit about the IUCN structure, and I think it's a really opportune time because we have Brent and Harry on the call representing the commissions. But I think it's useful for everyone just to understand how the union works. And we've very much structured our regional strategy space and our OECM work around harnessing these benefits from IUCN. So there's basically three legs to this union, the largest environmental network. The first is our members. So these are civil society, state members, and local communities and indigenous people groups that can be members of IUCN. In Pan-Africa, we have over 211 with 16 states. We then have 7 expert commissions, and they touch on a number of different topics related to conservation, from environmental, economic, social policy, environmental laws, species, survival commission, climate change, ecosystem management, education and communication, and then the one most relevant to this discussion is the World Commission on Protected Areas. And then there's the Secretariat, and the Secretariat really is there to, one, lobby and advocate for policy change at a global and regional level and within the various conventions. It's to convene our members and our commissions in various fora. We've got the World Conservation Commission coming up in October, the African Conservation Forum, the first African Protected and Conserved Areas conference was held. So it really brings these members and these experts together to deliberate where IUCN should be going and where we should be lobbying. And then it's the action on the ground, which are our members delivering conservation outcomes on the ground with communities. And then fourth is the data generation and the development of knowledge products and guidance. So those are really the tools that we're focusing on when helping deliver on Target 3. Now, I think Harry touched on it really well. There are a lot of opportunities, but there are also challenges concerning OECMs. And these opportunities aren't always guaranteed. They're often quite specific to the national context or national priorities. And when IUCN started considering how best we're going to support the implementation of OECMs in the region, we really felt like if we wanted to harness those opportunities, it was going to come down to the national process of recognizing OECMs and making sure that that process amounts to inclusive, equitable processes that deliver on benefits and rights to those people. And that's really how we designed our strategy. We first developed our strategy in 2022, and since we've seen agreement of the GBF, a number of other African countries have come on board and are really interested in identifying OECMs. At present, unfortunately, we only have one country in our region that have actually reported OECMs up to the World Database, that's Eswatini. But there are a number of other countries who have gone down this road of an OECM dialogue and are starting to discuss and identify OECMs. We have 3 countries in the midst of the national OECM dialogue, 3 countries that have actually started assessing OECMs, 4 countries that are in the midst of a dialogue, as well as the West Indian Ocean, and 5 countries who have requested support with their national dialogues in the region. So it's a really big footprint, and I think collectively this starts creating a massive groundswell for generating local lessons and guidance. So last year, IUCN started developing a strategy specifically for Target 3, and embedded within this strategy is our work on OECMs. And the reason I'm presenting the entire strategy is just to illustrate that we really have to see OECMs within the larger context of Target 3. And so this strategy space has 4 main stages. The first is Amplify, which is really integrating inclusive conservation areas into naturescapes, i.e. recognizing OECMs. The second is Assess, assessing these naturescapes, these sites, in terms of how effective they are and how equitable they are, and then plugging the gaps by developing improvement pathways. The third stage is the Improve, so that's taking that improvement pathway, using assessment tools like the IUCN Green List, or even the OECM assessment tool can be used as a tool to identify gaps and develop pathways to strengthening those sites. And very closely linked to that is sustainable finance. How do we unlock more finance to help sites plug those gaps? And the fourth stage is really around sharing. It's about co-creating knowledge in Africa to allow us to drive our agenda for people and nature. So it's about taking this awesome global guidance that has been developed and almost domesticating it or harmonizing it to the regional and national contexts. So the Amplify stage has really been a framework that we've been developing over a number of years based on national dialogues that we've been involved in. Starting back in South Africa a number of years ago, this is really where Harry and I started our journey together on OECMs. Now to Kenya, to Angola, Eswatini, Namibia. So these are all countries that we've been slowly supporting OECM dialogues. And through that experience, we've developed I don't want to call it a framework because I use that word in too many different contexts, but a process with a number of fundamental steps that we believe are really important to support these processes and make sure that they're inclusive and equitable. So the first stepping stone, as we call it, is the national dialogue. So these need to be facilitated through inclusive dialogues. It starts with bilaterals with government and civil society to gain political will and support. But then you have a number of stakeholder dialogues after that. One of the fundamental pieces of work that inform those dialogues are policy reviews. And this is where we work with an expert national environmental law firm or organization that help us review all the existing policy and legal frameworks in the country and assess how well they may align with OECMs. It also helps us unpack what's currently defined as a protected area and what's not, and where conservation areas are defined, but then to identify the gaps in the policy and legislative frameworks. The third stepping stone is then case study assessments. This all remains fairly theoretical until we actually get on the ground and assess sites as OECMs. So we would select a cross-section of potential OECMs that have been identified during the workshops, and we would assess them using the WCPA's assessment tool and come back with the results. The exercise also gives us an opportunity to cost this, because at the end of the day, someone has to pay for it, someone has to do it. And we need to know how much it's going to cost, as well as identify opportunities to really support that assessment process and even the validation process. And then the last stepping stone is actually the development of an OECM framework, using all this information that we have created through these stakeholder dialogues, coming out the other end with a framework that tells us how the country is going to assess, recognize, strengthen, and report OECMs, ensuring that it's equitable, representative, and so forth. So the outcomes of these dialogues are really many that we aim to achieve. And The first is that we have a common understanding of what OECMs are. And this may seem pretty straightforward, but it's not. It's not a given. It takes many dialogues to get people on the same page around what could be potential OECMs within a national context. It's also to ensure that these stakeholder groups are inclusive and representative. So it gives you an opportunity to kind of bring everyone together that's engaging in area-based conservation. It allows people to understand the difference between protected areas and OECMs within the national context, generate some OECM case studies, review national policy and identify gaps, develop a national OECM roadmap that really tells us how we're going to get to the end point, list potential OECMs within your national context, domesticate or harmonize, whichever word fits better, the global guidance with a national context. So that is not to say to change the definition, but really to take the guidance and harmonize it with local legislation and context. And lastly, it's a real opportunity to engage with multiple ministries as well as across various sectors, because it's not just the Ministry of Environment that you will engage, it's the Ministry of Fisheries, Agriculture, and many other role players where they might be finding OECMs. At the end of that, you're going to come out with a framework. And essentially what the OECM national framework would look like or include is that you would have some kind of established, recognized representative group that is inclusive of all the stakeholders driving this process. You would refine the national objectives for OECMs. So in order to maintain momentum, OECMs need to speak to your national priorities, and you agree on that during these stakeholder workshops. Systematic spatial planning is really important. I'll talk to that in a bit, and Harry's already touched on it, but that's really to identify the priority areas where you want to find your potential OECMs. Strengthening enabling standards, policies, and legislation that are going to strengthen and underpin OECMs down the line and their recognition. Developing an assessment, monitoring, and validation process in country. And then lastly, a process then for reporting OECMs nationally and internationally. So there might be more aspects that you want to include in a national framework, but these are kind of the bare bones that we've identified as we've been through this process. There are a couple of core principles that we stick to and really try and encourage these national dialogues to respect. First is that the assessment and reporting of OECMs need to be done on a site-by-site basis. Every site is different, and you need the consent of that governance structure. Landscapes of multiple sites can't be assessed collectively, but you can identify priority landscapes. You need landowner consent. As Brent said, OECMs need to demonstrate biodiversity value and conservation outcomes. It's recommended that they are evaluated or validated through transparent evaluation processes, and then that they should be reported both nationally and internationally. As I said, I can't go through any specific case studies from the region. We have been assessing quite a number now through our national dialogues in South Africa, military training facility and academic research institute. In Angola and South Africa, we've been assessing community rangeland sites in the Miamba woodlands as well, and then community fish reserves in Namibia and Angola. But we are seeing more and more diverse sites being assessed right now. What I'm just going to talk about are three commonalities that I've pulled out of these assessments. The first one is connectivity, and I think Harry spoke to it, and we're seeing it on the ground as we assess these sites. Particularly in transfrontier conservation areas in SADC area, they're really large landscapes, and we're seeing how these OECMs are fitting in between existing protected areas and contributing to connectivity and buffering PAs. We're also seeing the important role they play in securing ecosystem services. And here's an example from the Angola Highlands Water Tower. There's a number of communities that are up in that water tower, but securing that water tower feeds major rivers in the Kavango-Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area, ending up in the Okavango Delta. My time is running out. I'm just going to go through these last few slides. The second commonality is that in most cases, You are going to have to look at how to strengthen monitoring, enforcement, and governance. No site is perfect, not even protected areas. And there's often work that has to be done to strengthen them, to get them up to a benchmark. And so it often becomes a consideration of how you blend traditional governance and traditional mechanisms with more modern mechanisms, like documenting how the governance structure is constructed or how management decisions are being made. And it's this type of guidance that we're looking at developing at a regional level. And then unlocking benefits. As I said, every site needs additional assistance, but in the context of OECMs in Southern Africa and East Africa, it's always going to be a question of how do we improve livelihoods, because these communities are living on these natural resources. How are we addressing local threats such as human-wildlife conflict, water and drought preparedness? And then how do we unlock more finance for these sites, both traditional donors as well as more sustainable finance? My last slide, I promise, is the key lessons that we have learned through these national dialogues. Firstly, it's a journey that takes time, so plan long and plan for multiple engagements. You cannot have this dialogue in one stakeholder meeting. It normally takes 3 or more. Understand the national political structures and how these various ministries work together. It's often a unique process designed around national context, but with universal concepts. So IUCN has developed what we believe are universal concepts. The fourth is that it's as much about strengthening these sites as it is about recognizing them, positioning OECMs to address regional challenges, as I mentioned, blending traditional with modern systems. And then last but not least is that it requires partnerships. And this is really where we've seen the strength of the OECM dialogues. I'll take this opportunity just to recognize the partners we've worked with at a national level in Angola, Fundação Lucima, Wild Bird Trust, BirdLife South Africa, our global partners, WWF, the Nature Conservancy, of course, our commission, and then sector representatives like the Alliance for Indigenous Peoples and local communities for conservation in Africa. These partnerships are really fundamental to these national dialogues. And I think the key message is that we want to have one dialogue, not multiple dialogues. So it's an opportunity for partners to come together and pool resources. So I'm going to end there, and sorry for going slightly over time.
Thank you for the presentation, Daniel. Thank you. I think the one thing I can say, if I was to summarize your presentation, is it's really a presentation on OECMs in practice. You took us through the process, opportunities, lessons. It was interesting to see that at IUCN regional office, you have your regional conservation strategy, and then you have a regional OECM strategy, and how that then cascades down into these steps and stages that you have done for OECMs. And what was really interesting was to see how you're moving from the conceptualization of those strategies and those tools and the steps to actually putting it into practice through the dialogues and other processes that you're doing. So thank you for that. We're going to move to another region. So that was Southern Africa, Southern and Eastern Africa. We're going to move to another region. I'm going to invite our good friend Lucia Ruiz Bustos from WWF US. She is leading initiatives across Latin America, Africa, and Asia, and has over 17 years in biodiversity policy and conservation finance. Lucia, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for joining, and thank you, Secretariat of the CBD, for organizing this webinar. I will be presenting a little bit of our joint work between WWF and many other organizations, partners, indigenous organizations in Latin America, and how we have been building community-led initiatives and integration throughout the region. So I would like to begin by giving you a little bit of a journey to Latin America. So in 2020, based and inspired by the Protected Planet report that is published every 2 years, Latin America decided to do its own Protected Planet report and analyze what were the trends towards achieving Target 11 of Aichi targets. And what was very surprising was that a regional level, the protection of terrestrial protected areas had jointly would add up to 24% of terrestrial territorial biomes and surpassed 19% of marine and coastal territories. So this is very interesting because actually this region is the most protected in the world. And however, there are many, many sites that are still out of protected areas. And we need to make sure that those sites are not only secured, but are also supported through different options. And that's where the opportunity of OECMs comes in. Additionally, more than 520 indigenous peoples, different indigenous peoples live in the region with nearly 40 million inhabitants. So if we consider this, how are we supporting those indigenous peoples, as well as many other efforts that are being taken on the ground to make sure that sites outside of protected areas can be secured, can be protected, and are contributing to conservation targets such as Target 3 of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So just to give you also a little bit of a journey of where is Latin America on OECMs, I would like to show you a little bit about the current situation and share with you some of the examples. So what we have realized is that there are at least 2 countries that have reported OECMs to the Protected Planet database. There are 49 OECMs nowadays reported to the Protected Planet, 47 from Colombia, 2 from Peru. Also, there has been a lot of advances on discussing what could be the potential legal regulations, legal frameworks to support the implementation of this OECM framework. So Ecuador and Peru in 2023 were were pioneers basically on developing legal regulations to identify, recognize, and report OECMs. And the importance about this is that these 2 countries already have a process in place to make sure that anyone who wants to engage with the OECM framework, that wants to implement the OECM framework, can allow those who are interested on having a process. And Daniel, you mentioned a lot about this. It's not just about coming together, discussing, but also about making sure that we can have systematized processes at a country level that are not only adopted, but also adapted to your local context. And Ecuador and Peru have been pioneers in this. And sorry, there was a mistake in this third bullet. It is Ecuador who has recognized 2 indigenous managed OECMs. So Ecuador, although they have not reported officially 5 OECMs that they have recognized at a national level to the Protected Planet database, Ecuador has already recognized 2 indigenous managed OECMs, which is historic, and what we need to learn how it is being done to make sure that those processes of free, prior, and informed consent, the processes in which they were consulted, but also the motivations to get engaged with the OECM framework. How did it happen? And this type of systematization of lessons learned is fundamental to make sure that we can learn from that, but also replicate those lessons learned in other parts of Latin America and in other regions of the world. And finally, just to share with you that over 15 countries over the region are working on implementing the OECM framework with a diversity of approaches. And when we talk about a diversity of perspectives or approaches, we're talking about spaces for dialogue that we will touch on in just a minute, identification processes, as I just mentioned, and I'll give you an example in just a second, monitoring. There are many countries that are beginning to engage on, okay, we have an OECM, we are reporting an OECM, we are recognizing an OECM, but what happens next? It's not just about reporting to an international database and just that's where the story ends. That's actually the end of the beginning. So how can we make sure that the monitoring of positive conservation outcomes can include also the context of that country, of that site? So in some countries, the monitoring efforts are being focused on how to develop indicators that are relevant at a context, at a national context level. Spaces for dialogue, subnational efforts as well. How can OECMs not be only led by national efforts, but how can this be with under the understanding of a bottom-up approach? How can subnational efforts be also included? Then financial and non-financial incentives. We know that always the $60 million question is how much money do we have to fund OECMs? But it's also about the non-financial incentives. How can we make sure that the motivations of people, either be it by recognizing their land tenure, by recognizing the rights to that land, or to ensure that they will have a voice on the table, will serve as non-financial incentives to engage with the OECM framework. And finally, governance. If we want to make sure that these sites will be conserved in the long term, we need to ensure that both management and governance institutional arrangements are in place and are strengthened. So those are the different perspectives that this over 15 countries throughout Mexico, Central America, Caribbean, the Amazon, and the Southern Cone in Latin America are advancing. The next steps is also developing the first analysis of the status and national progress of OECMs in Latin America and the Caribbean. The idea for this is to make sure that there is a first picture, a first analysis of where is the region on OECMs, where are the barriers, and where are the opportunities to better advance this. And we hope that this study will be ready towards the end of the year. But what about examples? You might be asking yourselves. So I would like to begin with Colombia. Colombia was the first country to report OECMs back in the day, around four years ago. But there have been a lot of lessons learned. Of course, when you are the pioneer, when you begin a process, it cannot be perfect. So there have been a lot of lessons learned on how to ensure more inclusive participatory processes through bringing together people on a platform called the Expanded Table in English, bringing together over 15 organizations that provides critical reflection on how to ensure that the OECMs are not only identified and reported through the proper consultation processes, but to make sure that the process gets better day by day. So it's not just about saying, okay, we already have a framework, but it's actually strengthening what it's already there. And there have been a lot of questions raised, but what I really like about the example in Colombia and the effort that is being made at all levels in the country is that there is a pause right now to continue advancing on just reporting, but actually assessing what is being done, what have been the lessons learned, and how to make sure that lessons are being systematized and that all of the organizations are going to come forward in a more strengthened way to approach this in a more strategic, systematized way. Then about Ecuador, I was mentioning earlier about this regulation for the recognition, registration, and reporting of OECMs. They have been very diligent at that, and they have begun having a lot of good conversations with organizations that are more on the territories. So there has been a recognition of a total of 5 OECMs, 2 of them managed by an NGO, Ecominga Foundation, in a very important ecological corridor. And Sakile, you talked about reinforcing the fact that OECMs can contribute to connectivity and to ecological representativity. That is precisely what is happening in the Yanganate-Sangay Ecological Corridor in Ecuador. These OECMs are contributing to secure vital fresh water sources for 3 towns and 1 city, supporting over 10,000 residents. Those types of impact, those types of measurements can be very interesting also in the short term for funders to make sure that these sites can be supported. And also from Ecuador, a very good lesson from the last 6 months is that they managed to two sites that are managed by indigenous peoples were recently recognized. They were the ones who raised their hand and said, we want to be recognized as an OECM. This can bring more protection to our sites. So the question is, how are we going to be supporting those sites in the long term? And finally, Peru, identification of over 20 conservation modalities in terrestrial biomes. They are beginning to do this at in the marine realm as well. But most interesting from Peru is that they developed not only this legal framework, but a tool to evaluate criteria adapted to the Peruvian context. So they took the 4 criteria of the CBD, the 26 criteria included in the annex that Harry mentioned earlier. And what they are doing is a table of values on a table adapted to the Peruvian context to understand how they could be evaluating each one of the criteria based on their own context. So very interesting lessons learned, but I would just like to jump at the, just to finalize the presentation with what is happening at a regional level beyond what is happening at each individual country. So in 2023, an OECM regional meeting took place in Lima, Peru, and there were a very good results. First of all, we were able to assess where were the expectations of people about the OECM framework, then whether people were using the site assessment tool or whether they knew about it, and how they felt that they were advancing with OECMs. So what we realized is that there is a lot of capacity building that still needs to be made. The main opportunities and challenges, many, but what we need to ensure is that there is an avoided misuse of the OECM framework to meet quantitative targets. And most importantly, and Brent, I think you mentioned it as well as Harry, we need to be assertive on implementing the OECM framework in Latin America, ensuring that we are contributing to long-term biodiversity conservation outcomes, but while serving as a complementarity to existing protected areas and not forgetting about them. Finally, the OECM collaborative agenda, there was a dialogue put together. Daniel, you mentioned that it would require 1, 2, 3 sessions, and that's precisely what is happening in Latin America, making sure that a community of practice is growing. Last year, an OECM collaborative agenda was put together as a result of a dialogue of over 80 people, 15 countries, 15 indigenous organizations, and 9 topics were discussed. Those 9 topics that were discussed are now the agenda for Latin America to bring together many other stakeholders and make sure that OECMs can contribute to effective, equitable, and inclusive conservation outcomes. But most importantly, that there is already 9 working groups, each one under one of these topics, that are working together and will be reporting every 3 months. And finally, tell us if you want to download the collaborative agenda, please consult this QR. And in these 10 last seconds that I have, I won't be able to show you a video, but we do want to invite you, if you want to be part of this OECM collaborative agenda 2025-2030, that is being led and put together by many organizations, not just the only ones that you're seeing on the screen. We invite you to join we invite you to join this collective effort. So thank you, everyone, and over to you, Sakile.
Thank you, Lucia. Very, very interesting to hear what's happening in Latin America and the Caribbean. Yes, it was interesting for me to hear that it's the most protected region, so that's really good. I liked how you showed the process of how the region is recognizing OECMs, indigenous and traditional territories, including integration of FPIC. We had a question about FPIC earlier on. I like the examples from the region because they highlight different aspects. So for Colombia, I really like the expanded tables. So really for me, the inclusivity of that process. In Ecuador, the biodiversity benefits that were accrued from this process. And in Peru, how they adapted the CBD criteria for themselves. So creating scientific basis for the work on OECMs, which all the speakers have spoken about before. And the regional roadmap is really interesting. It's really interesting to see that the different regions are approaching OECMs not only from a site level or a national level, but really looking at it from a regional perspective. So that's really good. Thank you, Lucia. I'm going to go to Sunita, another one of our really good friends and partners. We do a lot of work with Sunita and her colleagues. Sunita Chowdhury is an ecosystem services specialist at the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, ICIMOD, where she leads research on ecosystem resilience and climate adaptation in the Hindu Kush Himalaya. So we moved from Southern Africa to Latin America, and so now we'd like to hear from Sunita about the Hindu Kush Himalaya and the transboundary approaches that they're using there. Sunita, over to you.
Thank you, Sakile. Can you see the slide?
Yes.
And can you hear me well? Yes. Okay, so hello everyone. I'm Sunita, as Sakile introduced. Thank you, Sakile, and also CBD Secretariat, IUC and WCPA for this really webinar and having me on board. So I have changed my title a bit because I want to give you a bit of regional perspective what we are doing in the Hindu Kush Himalaya region. So I will be touching upon the transboundary OECM in the region, but going beyond and also share our work in India, Pakistan, and also in Nepal. So before that, I would just like to give the context, what is ICIMOD, what is the Hindu Kush Himalaya region. As you see in the slide, ICIMOD stands for International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, and we are intergovernmental organization serving the 8 countries, namely Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, China, India, Myanmar, Nepal, and last but not least, Pakistan. We are governed by these countries.
Sorry to interrupt you, but we're seeing your presentation, but we're not seeing your slides advancing. So you may need to go into presentation mode, or very sorry to interrupt you, but
No, it's fine. Can you see now, Brian?
It's coming up. No, we're still seeing all your slides on the side.
What about now?
We're still just seeing your first title slide. If you're using 2 screens, we might be seeing the other screen.
Sorry for that. I don't know.
No worries.
Now? What about now? Can you see it now?
Yeah, you can do it. You could do it that way. So if you clicked on your slide 2, we would see that. Yeah, to help you, what we're seeing is if you were editing your slides, not presenting your slides.
So what about this one? I have changed the view.
That's a bit better.
Okay.
If you advance to the next one, we'll know for sure.
Okay. Yeah, I'll repeat again. Thank you,
Okay.
Brent, for pointing that out.
You bet.
Yeah. So what I was saying is like I really want to introduce for easy mode and also the reason that we are working so that we can give you a glimpse where we are working and where we are advancing in terms of OECM. So easy mode, as you see, really stands for International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. We are an intergovernmental organization serving the governments of 8 countries. As you can see, namely Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, China, India, Myanmar, Nepal, and Pakistan. We are a knowledge and learning center, and we really believe in evidence-based policy making and also support the government in terms of piloting and also advocacy of the important regional issues to the global platform. So here, the Hindu Kush Himalaya region, as many of you might have already seen, we are really on the top of the world, showing that we are more than like so many mountains above 7,000 meters from above the sea level are situated in this region. That's why we often say that the Hindu Kush Himalaya region is sitting, it's also the roof of the world. The region is really rich in terms of like biodiversity and others, but you can see the region is the source of 12 major Asian rivers system, and it supports millions and billions of the people, not only in the region, but also downstream of this Hindu Kush Himalaya region. And that's why we really see that this is not only a regional asset, but this is a global asset that really supports the high biodiversity hotspots in the region and also numerous protected areas and endangered species in this region. So we do not have a comprehensive set of biodiversity data from this region, but recently we conducted with the GBIF data sets and really shows that all across the taxonomic groups, we have rich biodiversity in this region across the all the taxonomic group. But unfortunately, as we know that this region is also highly vulnerable to so many threats. And you can see biodiversity loss is one of the major threats in this region because of climate change, urbanization, and so many other socioeconomic political factors. And because of this and compounded with so many other threats, you can see we analyze the population status of 3 major criteria from the IUCN, and you can see 90% of the species are in the decreasing trend, while only few species are in a stable condition and very few are in increasing trend. So, but if we see in the region is, as I said, very rich in terms of biodiversity, but also culturally, it's very important. And if you can see the history of protected area in this region, we can really see there is a high growth of protected areas who are conserving the globally threatened species, but also the other ecosystems and species in this region. And we analyze this protected area status from the WTPS datasets from 2007, where the nature reserves from China were still included in WTPS. And it really showed the region is extremely rich in terms of also protected areas. And as of now, from this data set, we can see we have around 575 protected areas across the region, including the small nature reserves in China. So we try to understand from across the 7 countries at the regional scale, which countries are where in terms of protected area status. Of course, 30% is a global target, but we still wanted to see for each country whether there is an opportunity for the country to contribute to 30%, 30 by 30 target. So you can see here, some countries are doing really well. Like for instance, Bhutan has exceeded far way than 30%, while other countries are still trying their best to contribute to 30%. But also within their country, they are also trying to protect their ecosystem and contribute to the target 3 of their country. So based on these gaps, we really wanted to see where is the opportunity for OECM across the whole 8 countries. So that's why, based on those gaps, we initiated OECM at Isimod in the Hindu-Kush-Himalaya region. But you see, HKH region is not a small piece of cake. So that's why we have initiated gradually in this region. So first, what we did is in this region, the term conservation indigenous people is highly sensitive, right? So that's why we first wanted to explore what is the policy arena in this region. We can really support the OECM establishment, which can provide the enabling conditions for us to see, to initiate OECM piloting in the region. None of the countries, unfortunately, have a specific policy on OECM, but there are so many enabling conditions by the institution, by the constitution itself, and also there are some guidelines underway in most of the countries which are very supportive for OECM establishment in the country. And this really gave us a good foundation for us to go ahead. So based on those status and gap and also the policy enabling condition, we started three. So the first one is we, with support from the Secretariat of the CBD, PBDI grant, we started to think about what are about the transboundary OECM. Because in this region, there are so many transboundary areas which really promote the conservation and which where the ecosystems are transboundary in nature. Beyond the country's boundaries. So that's why we thought it's really important for us to focus on transboundary OECM rather than individual. We also focus on individual, but let's see what are the transboundary OECM. So first one, the second one, because of the gaps in the policy, so we are really supporting the countries, especially the government of Pakistan and Nagaland state of government of India. We're trying to support the government and also the local communities in coming up with the policy on OECM. And the last one, because indigenous people and local communities are one of the main pillars of OECM, so we really want them to be on board because there are also so many negative perception about OECM in this region. So we really want to have indigenous peoples and local communities on board so that we are on the same page and go together with them for OECM in this region. So the first one, when we collaborated with the Secretariat, with CBD, Mariano, and Sakile, based on guided by the IUCN global criteria, but also regional perspective and also our CBD4 criteria, we had our own methodological framework based on different stakeholders who provided inputs to that one. And based on this, the first criteria, one of the main criteria about the high biological values. So we thought, what should we do now? So there are so many already given biodiversity high areas, like key biodiversity areas, important plant areas, right? So based on that, we chose the key biodiversity areas to be one of the biodiversity indicator for this region. And this one, we identify the individual KBAs, but also you can see on the slides, there are around 200 plus individual key biodiversity areas across the Hindu-Kush-Himalaya region in 8 countries, which are outside protected areas. So these KBs are not protected by protected area system. These are still outside the PA system and really has high opportunity to be declared as, to be considered as OECM by different governance systems. So this really gave us high optimism. And then we decided to do map out transboundary KBAs across the region. So even in this one, you can see we found 105 transboundary KBAs, which are spanning across the boundary of the 8 countries. And these KBAs are, of course, out of the protected areas, really saw the opportunity for transboundary OECM. But of course, we need to also see the governance system and also the political and other factors, because we are talking the target 3 beyond national boundary. And then after mapping those exercises in 2024, on July, August, in the CBD Secretariat and also Mission Coalition, you can see we convened a capacity building workshop, but also we conducted a workshop where we brought stakeholders up to national and global scale together could be potential OECM or not. If not, then what other OECM can be there? We can really work at the transboundary level. So based on that multi-stakeholder analysis, the stakeholder itself mapped out 34 transboundary OECM during that multi-stakeholder. And out of that, 11 were identified for piloting. And then we really have started to choose one transboundary OECM in between Nepal and India for piloting. So this one is falls in the Eastern Himalaya, where you can see the eastern side is like a PIT, like the Red Panda Corridor, which is very important habitat for Nepal. But also that ecosystem continues to the other ecosystem in India. So if we can have this transboundary ecosystem, not only the biodiversity like Red Panda and others, but also the culture are similar. And they are kind of one integrated landscape. So that's why we aim to initiate a feasibility assessment in collaboration with the stakeholder. In policy, we said that we had one workshop with the government of Pakistan, with the Ministry of Forest, and we have agreed to start drafting the national policy on OECM for Pakistan in collaboration with the Ministry of Climate Change. And also here we started inclusive conservation. Today we started inclusive conservation workshop where we have brought more than 11 ethnic groups from east, west, north, and south, whole across the Nepal, and we are trying to map out like indigenous people perspective on OECM. Also, what are key of the national biodiversity strategy so that it can be nationalized and we can go forward with OECM in Nepal. And also beside this, we already collaborated with the Nagaland Nagaland State Biodiversity Board and community organization to have a state level community conserved area policy in Nagaland. So with this, I would like to thank you, and then I'm happy for the question. Back to you, Sakhi.
Thank you, Sunita. You raised some really interesting examples and points. I was very interested in the map that showed the Hindu Kush Himalaya, and it seems to be a very vibrant political, biodiversity, economic, and social system that is interconnected at many different ways and at many different levels. And I like that it was also rich in biodiversity, but also protected areas. And the work that you are doing to support the countries to reach 30%. And my understanding from your presentation is that the region is really looking towards OECMs as the easiest way of reaching that 30% target. The approach of using transboundary OECMs and working with indigenous peoples and local communities, very similar to Latin America as well, and also Southern Africa. And I'm looking forward to seeing how those OECMs, potential sites that were mapped, the 34 sites, will work out in the future. So we'll be following that. Thank you, Sunita. And finally to Carolina, very, very good friend. Yes, Carolina and I go way back in this space. So Carolina is a senior policy advisor for area-based conservation measures at the Nature Conservancy. And she also co-chairs the IUC and OECM working group for NGOs and academia. And she'll be busting some myths for us, I believe, this morning. Carolina, before I give you the floor, I just wanted to apologize to everybody who joined the webinar. We had really scheduled this webinar in a way to allow some time for Q&A, but it looks like we're really running behind schedule a lot and we won't be able to have that much time. I wanted to invite anybody who might have an experience of an OECM process to maybe put that in the chat, and we might give you like a couple of minutes to share your own experiences, because really you want to hear from experiences of different actors on the ground on OECM. So if you have an experience, please put your name or put the experience in the chat and we'll try to give you some time to speak. But Carolina, over to you.
Thank you, Sakili. Thank you so much. Very true. Good friendship, long standing friendship. Hello, colleagues. Hello, friends. Good day for everyone. It's afternoon for me, not morning. I'm based in the UK. Thanks for the opportunity, for the invitation to join this community of practice. This is such an honor for me. We know we're a bit behind time, and my presentation is intended to be short. We always say that, and we pass over time. I put a clock here to see if I can keep, and we still have some time for questions and answers. So let me share my presentation here with you. Share. You can see my screen, I suppose. Continue sharing. Yes. Okay, so we have heard from colleagues, Harry particularly, and also Sakili, saying what OECMs are, what the concepts, definition, criteria, etc. But what I will be talking about is not what they are, but what eventually they are not. And the reason, what motivated this presentation and the paper that that you see here, is that TNC and myself particularly have been engaging with a number of national processes to develop and implement OECMs, such as the ones that Lucia mentioned in Latin America, or the ones that Daniel has mentioned in Africa. We are co-delivering, co-sponsoring these initiatives. And I also lead a learning network, which is something very similar to what we are doing here. I lead within TNC a learning network on OECMs. We are in 70 countries, so you can imagine that the interest, and we have quite many colleagues participating. So we are learning the doubts, the questions around OECMs. And because the OECM is a rather new concept, or the criteria defined rather recent, I mean 2018, but it still is not as old as protected areas with 100 years. And the fact that Target 3 was adopted recently under the Global Biodiversity Framework with the ambition to conserve 30% of the country's territories. And there is a bit of an interest in OECM. So how can you use OECMs to contribute and complement the protected areas network to deliver the global commitment? Therefore, the interest is it's there. And of course, being a kind of a rather new concept, as I said, there are many questions. Does it work? Is it this? Is it that? I think that's the way to go anyway. And then based on this participating in this fora and getting so many questions, and also listening some misunderstanding, potentially misconceptions around OECM. Myself and a couple of colleagues from TNC, you can see here, we decided to put in a very short paper we selected 6 misconceptions that we are calling, just to help guide the countries and the stakeholders that are supporting the governments to develop their national agendas on OECM. So James Fitzsimon, myself, and Joanna Smith, we wrote this paper, which was published a couple of months ago, and I'll put the link in the chat for those that are interested. It's a very short, very sharp, so you won't spend much time. And I'll go through, to each of them very quickly, because again, we don't have much time. So the first one is that if an area, if it is not a protected area on public, it must be an OECM. So traditionally, protected areas are put in some countries in public land. And what we've been hearing is that, in my country, we only allow a protected area in public land, or we understand that protected areas are to be in public land, and everything else, if we are to include private land or private governed areas or indigenous traditional territories, they should be OECM. Actually, this is a misconception based on the CBD and IUCN guidance and decisions, etc., which says that protected areas can have both private, communal, and public tenure. The land can be owned by these stakeholders, but also the governance of the areas can be private, communal, and public, or a mix of them. So if a country is interested to expand their network of protected and conserved areas into private or communal land, or have them governed by these other stakeholders, they can either decide to change their national legislation or just apply a concept that is accepted globally, change their legislations to that purpose, or eventually OECMs, but it doesn't need to be an OECM. So it's a bit of a misconception there. The other thing is that OECMs do not need to be long-term. So we've heard many, a few colleagues or stakeholders saying, oh, right, protected areas are forever, they are permanent, but OECMs, we can do that for a short period. This is not the case. We've seen in the definition itself and in all the guidance, including one criteria, mentions that OECM should be long-term. Of course, that is a bit easier, so to speak, to set an area for conservation in a public land or eventually in a traditional land, which are the peoples are there for a long time and they have the intention to continue that for a longer time, but also for private owners. What we think that potentially there will be a mechanism in place that will allow them to provide the means for conservation of biodiversity for a longer term. But the multi-generation intention for conservation of biodiversity in that space should be there. So these are another thing that we wanted to highlight. And where is the, okay. And then I wanted to share for that matter, a technical note that was published by IUCN and WCPA that talks about defining long-term. Of course, long-term varies a lot between countries, what that is, but as I said, we are looking at a multi-generational intent of the conservation measures in place for that area. The third misconceptions is OECMs are quicker and easier to implement or recognize than protected areas. Again, the OECM shouldn't be seen as a quick fix and a means or measures to achieve 30% and then job done, but rather we understand the definition, the concept, and the idea actually, to produce biodiversity outcomes, right? And then we know that for OECMs to be recognized, there's a whole process. IUCN has a guidance on how to recognize OECMs. We've got to go through the criteria. So there is a process to recognize. Also, an area to be recognized as an OECM, if not in areas and proposed by indigenous and local communities themselves, if from other stakeholders, the communities and the indigenous community should be consulted. So free, prior, informed consent, which also takes some time. And monitoring should be in place to secure or to tell the story that OECMs are producing the conservation outcome that it was set or it is to be delivering in the first place. So it's not a quick and easy and a thing, but to achieve the 30%. But really should be looking at the quality of OECMs, and it takes some time and efforts as well in looking at the areas that are really important for biodiversity conservation and not setting that in any place as can be a easy, quick and fix. Misconception 4 is that OECMs need specific legislation, legislative recognition, or specific designation. Again, in the other effective conservation measures of the acronym OECMs means that any other area that is not a protected area could be given it is conserving biodiversity could be recognized. And we know that protected area as an OECM, sorry, not complementing that, but we know the protected areas in most countries needs to be adopted by, be gazetted, be adopted by a law, a decree, etc. And OECMs could be other ways and means that the country may find to designate the sites or to recognize the sites and put in a repository. Of course, going through all the criteria, you understand that the area has its biodiversity values and serving the purpose to promote the conservation on the long run, but there are other means that not a legislation per se that can be used by countries to recognize these OECMs. The fifth one, just looking at the time, I have 1.5 minutes. The fifth one is dedicated funding streams are required for OECMs. That's a very tricky and interesting one because in principle, or originally OECMs are thought to be areas that are already delivering biodiversity conservation. So we assume that there is already a governance in place, there is a management, there are management measures in place, and therefore we assume that some funding are already being invested in that area. We know, and then we see, however, that the way that OECMs are developing, it's not the case, and OECMs are almost kind of being created, so to speak, in the sense that we mentioned protected areas, and therefore there's not a governance or a management in place, and therefore new funds needs to be attributed to that area. But again, this is not an assumption, an initial assumption that OECMs require. And finally, if fisheries closures do not qualify as protected areas, they must be OECMs. Again, that is a very interesting and one that point and one that we've been hearing a lot. And fisheries areas, management areas have been for many closures have been considered many times as a potential protected areas, and in cases where they cannot be, some stakeholders are saying, okay, let's make it OECMs. So a couple of things here to highlight. OECMs are areas where we should be looking at a whole ecosystem being oops, sorry, my alarm ring here, which means that my time is up. But what it means that we are looking at the whole ecosystems within an OECM space. It's not just eventually for protection of one species, which is the case of some fisheries closures. The other thing is some fisheries closures are also temporary, and we are looking at, as said before, for long-term conservation for OECMs. Of course, that there are some fisheries areas that are co-delivering conservation, and they could eventually be considered as OECMs, but it's not any fisheries closures. So we should be looking at that attentively and going through the criteria as indicated. So, and I wanted to show here, and I've seen that Kim is online. I've seen a question from him in the very beginning. So FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, has produced 2 handbooks on how marine fisheries and inland water fisheries relate to OECMs. So I think that these are good references to have a look at. And with that, I've finished my quick intervention, but very, very happy that you contact me after, or you'll get access to the, oh, stop sharing, sorry. You have access to the document. Thank you, Sakile, very much, and sorry for rush a bit.
Thank you for trying to help us with the time there. I thank you for sharing the work that you and your colleagues have done, running us through those 6 misconceptions, going from longevity of these areas, their status, regulations, finance, and what can and can't do, what can and can't be counted in the marine space. So thank you for sharing that. And because you were very kind to go through your presentation very fast, we might have time to take some examples. I'm just looking through the chat right now. I don't see anybody asking to. Okay, I have a comment here from Gladys Warigia. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. Maybe you want to share your experience from Kenya?
Hello?
Yes, Gladys.
Can you hear me?
Yes, over to you.
Okay, I think lots of great lessons. Thank you for all that have presented. Pretty much for us has been the dialogue on how do we, first of all, number one, understand what OECMs are across the different sectoral areas. As I've mentioned, for Kenya, our natural resources governance are not within one specific docket of management or even legislation. So wildlife is on its own, water is on its own, forest is on its own. And so having a collective dialogue has not been easy, and especially just even understanding the concept itself. And so we've had quite a number of dialogues, and I'm happy that the likes of Carolina here have been facilitating the dialogues. And so we are a stage where we agreed that number one, we require sort of a policy guideline on how to go about it. And so one of the opportunities we are looking into is whether we can have sort of an integrated policy framework for all these natural resources. So that is not easy to achieve. So it's still in the conversation. So it's not one of the easy things to achieve. But the quick wins we are trying to tap into include we are in the process of reviewing a number of our legislations, including the wildlife legislation. And so recently we have a draft bill that was published. And one was to whether we can have even just a basic sort of an understanding through inserting a definition. And so we have the definition. And then we tried to expand on what scope will that entail in terms of recognizing how do sort of communities and landowners or even the government get to sort of recognize an OECM. And one of the things, maybe I don't know whether it is a misconception, whether it needs to be inserted in a misconception, is that we require management plans for OECMs, and the management plans required to be gazetted by the national government through sort of a legal process, so that if the government is the one responsible sort of for communicating or reporting, then what government understands how that can be achieved is maybe you developed a management plan for your respective OECM and the government approved of it and sort of even is monitoring its implementation. So that's one of the biggest struggles that we're having. And so maybe that needs to be included in one of the misconceptions. And I like the idea of that you may need a legislation, you may not need a legislation to go about it. But I think it's a big struggle for countries to really see how to recognize, because again, for countries and governments, what they recognize and how they recognize such processes, including the PAs and the likes, is through legislations. And so I think a lot of work needs to go into also just trying to see if a government decides to go through the legislative angle, what are the things that needs to go into that legislation so that you also don't sort of misconstrue. But also if it's not within the legislation, can we develop sort of guidelines in the meantime that can inform and guide, and as people get into the practice of it, then if legislations are required later on, then we can go into the legislation. But I think a lot of support is required to entities and governments and some government support organizations to go into it. But rather, this has been quite informative. Thank you, Nova.
Thank you, Gladys. Yes, what you're saying, we've heard it across different regions, that countries are finding it difficult to wrestle with the issue of OECMs because they really need the regulatory framework to support the decision-making around that. So it is something that we hope to be able to continue having discussions about. I see Daniel has raised his hand, but before I give the floor to Daniel, I just want to make a quick response to Hyacinth. Thank you, Hyacinth. In follow-up to our workshop in the Caribbean last year, we unfortunately have not been able to engage on ongoing work regarding that workshop. What we are doing as a secretariat is we're trying to work with the organizations that have been designated as regional technical and scientific coordination centers to provide sort of ongoing support, because we realize the weakness of the workshop approach. It's great. You bring people into one space, they talk, they exchange ideas, and then you stop. You can't go on. And so what we're trying to do is we're working with these centers that have been designated as regional technical and scientific coordination centers, and we're trying to raise funds as we can to provide that ongoing support, or to provide a kickstart to the support of providing support to the countries. So we may, for example, be reaching out to you as we receive funds for this work to see if we could work with either IUCN or CARICOM, or IUCN and CARICOM and other partners in the region to see how we can get this work going forward. So then, yes, Daniel, I will give Daniel the floor and then we will close. Unfortunately, we don't have time for more questions and comments. Daniel?
Yeah, sorry, thanks, Akili. I don't want to steal from anyone else's, but I wanted to briefly talk to Gladys's point because I think it is really important. One of the steps we've introduced in the national dialogues is really now to start domesticating the guidance. In Angola, they've wanted to call it harmonized, but It's looking at the guidance, essentially the criteria in the assessment tool, and developing means of verification and the other word has escaped me now, indicators for that criteria. So you would essentially look at what are existing national indicators and means of verification to prove that there is management in place. So to Gladys's question, you don't have to develop a management plan and have it gazetted according to the definition, but you can decide within the national context what's existing to illustrate that there is management in place and that there is some kind of means of verification to prove that there is management in place. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it's a very useful exercise for countries to go through. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. This is why it's always important to have people working on the ground in the regions to be able to provide experience and context relevant responses. So I'd like to thank all our colleagues, all our friends that we've been working with over the years on these issues. Brent, Harry, Daniel, Lucia, Sunita, and Carolina. I think that we received a lot of information, a lot of examples. I'm looking at the chat. We still have 21 questions that are open that we have not been able to get to. And this is what we're finding on OECMs. People want to talk about OECMs. People want to know more about OECMs. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go back to have a discussion with our partners. We'll have a discussion with within the community of praxis to see how we can, build on these kind of questions and how these questions could form the basis for future webinars so that we can keep the momentum and the discussion going on OECMs and other areas relating to Target 3, such as connectivity and representativeness and areas important for biodiversity. So I'd like to thank everybody. Thank you to all the participants that stayed with us. We had a really great participation today. And just want to thank you and wish everybody a very good afternoon, evening, morning, night, depending on where you are. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invite. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.